A little bit of introduction first. If we haven't met, my name is Tom Strebeck. I'm the technical assistant here at the museum. So that means I essentially do a little bit of everything. So some days I'm helping with the collection, some days I'm helping with school groups, and some days I even get to talk to groups like y'all. And just between you and me, this is my favorite part. So I've been here for a little more than a year now. It's a really great place, and what helps make it great is people like y'all from the community who come out and support us and come to our programs. It really means a lot to us. And while I'm giving my talk, the Air Force Base is obviously the focus, but while I was researching this, I realized you can't talk about the Air Force Base without talking about the town. So this isn't going to be a history of Myrtle Beach, the town, and then in parentheses, the Air Force, but occasionally we will talk about how the Air Force Base is affecting the city and how they're kind of feeding back into each other, because if you try to tell the story without that, you lose a lot of what is, I think, very important context. So, with that said, when I talk about Myrtle Beach, the image you probably have in your head is a tall skyline, the big light-up Ferris wheel, the big resort city that we all know and love. And when we start the talk, I need you to take that image and bundle it up and toss it out, because that is not the Myrtle Beach we're starting with. This is. These are pictures of Myrtle Beach from the decades before the Second World War, and this is what most of it looked like. You can see most of the buildings are houses. They're owned by individual families, and a lot of them, they have a spare room to rent, or maybe a few spare rooms to rent. And there are also, as you can see from the lower picture, a lot of buildings there's also a lot of open space between the buildings. There are large parts of the beach that are still owned by families that maybe only have one house on them, or maybe there's just nothing there at all. So in the early 20th century, Myrtle Beach is very small, it's very rural. It was essentially just the end of the railroad from Conway that Burroughs and Collins Company had started. In the early days, it didn't even have a name. They just called it Newtown, because Conway is the old town where the railroad started. Newtown is the terminal where it ends near the ocean. So it's very rural. There's not a lot of people here. And then in the 20s and 30s, things start changing. The leaders of South Carolina, they start to realize, we're an agricultural state, but we have the potential to be more of a tourist state. In Charleston in the 1920s and 30s, they start putting up historical markers. They start repainting Rainbow Row. They build the seawall by the Battery. They kind of dress that up. So there's this push going on in the early 20s and 30s to try to make South Carolina more of a tourist destination, which is something that hadn't really been done before. South Carolina was, at that point, it was an agricultural state. It was very rural. Horry County wasn't even a particularly noteworthy place. It was fairly in the middle in terms of population. So essentially, in this part of the world, Horry County was very big and mostly very empty. But in the 1920s, that starts to change. This photograph here is of a building that would eventually be called the $1 Million Hotel. This was one of the first really big projects around here to try to turn this place into a tourist destination. And this was the brainchild of two brothers from Greenville. Their last name was Woodside. And the Woodside brothers owned one of the biggest cotton mills in the United States. They owned a bank. The economy was booming. And they had a plan. They were going to build a new exclusive resort community right here on the South Carolina coast. They were going to call it Arcady. And that building, the $1 Million Hotel, or the actual name was the Ocean Forest Hotel, that was going to be the crown jewel. They were going to have big houses, gated neighborhoods, a couple of golf courses. That was the plan. Essentially, it was going to be a slightly overbuilt version of what Hilton Head Island is today. That was their big plan for what they wanted Horry County to look like. Because in the 1920s, the stock market was booming, it was the roaring 20s, and a lot of people were taking riskier and riskier investments because they thought, hey, we figured it out, the market is great, it's always going to be great, take a risk, invest your money, you can't lose. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed, and they lost. And the Woodside brothers, they were very stretched thin with all their new construction, but they thought, hey, the Hoover administration is going to bail us out, right? It didn't. The relief that they were hoping for, the Hoover administration, to their credit, they tried to help, but it was too little, too late, and the Woodside brothers, they lost everything. So That hotel, when it was finally finished, it was big. It dominated the skyline in a way that no building can today because of how, like we saw earlier, how small most of the other buildings were. And that reverted back to the mortgage holders for the property, Burroughs and Collins. And I feel like I'm mentioning them a lot. Just keep them in mind. They're going to come up again later. So while this is going on, while the local leaders are working to turn this place into a vacation destination, one of the things they do is they say, we need an actual airport, not an airstrip, we need an airport. The Woodside brothers, a few miles away from that hotel, had made a small grass airstrip, but that was designed for private planes in the 20s, which were small and not very common. So in the late 1930s, the leaders of what is now renamed Myrtle Beach decide, okay, we need an actual proper airport. But they are very quickly being overtaken by world events. So in 1937, the Empire of Japan invades China. They carry out horrible mass atrocities that shock and appall the world. And in response, the United States government says, hey, Japan, we've been selling you a lot of oil and metal for your war industries. That tap is closed. We are stopping that. That's over. If you're going to do this, we're not going to help you. And the Japanese really, really don't like that. But, when they break the rules, those things have to happen. And then 2 years later, 1939, Japan's ally Germany invades Poland, and that starts World War II in Europe. And early on, the American people don't want to get involved. They see this as someone else's problem. Congress passes 2 different neutrality acts, which essentially say, we really, really do not want to get involved in this time. But with war looming, the American government and the military quickly realize that we're going to get involved in this whether we like it or not. So while this is going on, Myrtle Beach incorporates. They become a recognized city in 1938. And one of the first things on their to-do list is to build that bigger airport I was talking about. So they get some land, they start clearing it, they start making a runway. And at this point, a lot of runways at airports aren't paved. So in 1940, the government says, hey, we're doing a program. We will help pave airports. We'll help pick up that cost. In exchange, if we help pave your runway at your airport, you have to give it to us when we ask. The people in Myrtle Beach thought, well, that sounds great. We're happy to help. We're happy to take the help. So they did. Then things start happening quickly. The first peacetime draft in American history is instituted, and America had wartime drafts before, but there had never been a draft in peacetime. This was something completely new. Later that year, the Army says, hey, we gave you the funds to help pave your airport. We need it now. Things are happening. We very much need that. And then December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the Empire of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor Naval Air Station. Most of the United States Pacific Fleet is destroyed, and America enters World War II. And suddenly that sense of, we don't want to get involved, that's replaced by all right, y'all started this, we're going to come finish it. So one of the big responsibilities early on for bases on the East Coast was doing submarine patrol. And that sounds weird to us now, but in the early days of World War II, and this doesn't get talked about a whole lot, the U-boat threat to the mainland United States was very serious. The German Navy took about a half a dozen U-boats and said, all right, y'all go hang out on the East Coast of the United States. If you see any big freighters, oil tankers, sink them. And they did. Thousands of sailors were killed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ships were sunk in the Gulf of Mexico and on the Atlantic coast, because this was not something that the Navy was prepared to fight. And that's not entirely their fault, because right after Pearl Harbor, a lot of our ships in the Atlantic were told, get to the Pacific, get there now. So there weren't a lot of ships, there weren't a lot of people, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure. This was just not a form of war we were prepared for. So one of the main ways that we fought this was through the Civil Air Patrol. So civilian pilots, many of them flying their own planes, took off from air bases across the East Coast with binoculars, notepad, and a radio, and they were looking for periscopes, for submarines, torpedo trails, and they were told, if you see anything, report it back. And this was a very serious threat. While I was researching this, I found a digital copy of a translation of the command log for a German submarine captain from World War II. And one of his entries, he said, We surfaced off the coast of South Carolina, and I saw the lights of Charleston through my periscope. That is haunting to read. So these civilian pilots were helping spot U-boats and protect ships, and they really needed the help because so many ships were sunk off the coast of North Carolina, they started calling it Torpedo Alley. So that was an important function, but one of the main thing that the Air Force Base, the Army Airfield did in World War II was training. So between Myrtle Beach and Conway, roughly where Carolina Forest is now, there was the Myrtle Beach Bombing and Gunnery Range. It was almost 250,000 square miles. And there were some homes and farms there. The people there were told, hey, we're about to use this as a bombing range. Pack your things, you need to leave. And I am happy to report, though, most of those homeowners were able to get back on their land after the war. So a lot of those people, after the war, they were able to come home. That's a happy ending to that story. And a lot of planes did their training here. There were bomber squadrons and groups from all over the Southeast where one of the last stages of their training was go to Myrtle Beach, do some bombing runs on the bombing and gunnery range, and then you're heading to Europe. And of course, some of these groups also went to the Pacific, including the most famous one, the Doolittle Raiders. So for those of you who may not have been familiar with that, right after Pearl Harbor, the United States government said, okay, we need to let the Japanese know that we are not going to take this lying down. We need to show them that, you just destroyed the Pacific Fleet, but we're not out of the fight yet. So they took a big squadron of bombers under the command of Commander Doolittle, and then put them on an aircraft carrier and said, all right, we'll get you as close as we can, bomb Japan, you're going to crash in China. Sorry, boys, this is a one-way trip. And the pilots, to a man, they said, all right, we're doing it. We're going to sacrifice for country. So they bombed Tokyo in the middle of the day. And in terms of buildings destroyed, they didn't do a whole lot of damage. There just weren't that many planes, and they weren't that big. But the psychological toll was enormous. The Japanese hadn't expected that. They thought, all right, America's going to cower, or that kind of disinterest they show, they'll sign a peace, we'll be done with this by Christmas. And then they're like, oh no, the Americans are here, and they're really, really angry. So the Doolittle Raiders, who did this really important mission, and this was one of the first pieces of good news America got after Pearl Harbor. Because while the fires at Pearl were still burning, the Japanese conquered Midway Island, Wake Island, a lot of America's island territories and bases in the Pacific. So this was one of the first pieces of good news the American people had after Pearl Harbor and this wave of Japanese conquest. And the other major function that the Army Airfield played was that it hosted a prisoner of war camp. At the end of the war, there were more than 600 German soldiers held at the Myrtle Beach prisoner of war camp. And you might be thinking, being a prisoner of war sounds unpleasant, but being a prisoner of war in Myrtle Beach, that sounds pretty nice. And you're exactly right. One of the international observers for the Red Cross, so someone whose job it is to go into a prisoner of war camp and to make sure the prisoners are being well treated, they're not being abused, they're having their rights as soldiers protected. So that's who he is. He goes to Myrtle Beach prisoner of war camp, and he reports saying, wow, this place reminds me of the summer camp I used to go to as a kid. So being a prisoner of war is obviously unpleasant, but there are a lot worse locales to be a prisoner of war in. And the prisoners, they helped kind of pick up the slack because a lot of the young men around here had joined to go and fight in the military, and others had gone to take defense jobs in bigger cities. So suddenly there was a labor shortage, so prisoners of war helped cut timber, harvest turpentine, pick cotton, pick tobacco, and some of them even did work around the base. So in our military gallery upstairs, we have a display about this. We actually have a trunk built by one of the prisoners of war. So the war effort in Horry County wasn't just kind of helping with the base, it was also helping keep these German prisoners occupied. And that's also an important part of the war that's kind of overlooked sometimes. Is that these German soldiers could and did write letters to their families. And as the war goes on and Germany starts losing and things are getting worse, that some Germans are getting letters from from their relatives that are in American POW camps, and they're writing about, oh, the Americans are so nice to us, and there's always enough food, and there's no rolling blackouts, and everything is just kind of we're working, but we're doing pretty well. That was a psychological gut punch to the German regime that Myrtle Beach really helped deliver. So the war ends, Myrtle Beach Army Airfield has played an important role in that. We've helped train a lot of men who have gone and been combat pilots over Europe. So this is what Myrtle Beach looks like in 1949. The Army Air Base closed in 1947, and the Myrtle Beach Pavilion there had actually burned. There was an accidental fire. It burned down during the war. It was rebuilt after. This is the first summer that it was reopened. And you can see in the background, Myrtle Beach, it's not big yet. Most of the houses are still small. The hotel you can see right behind the pavilion, that's one of the bigger hotels, and it's 3 or 4 stories tall. It's not very big. So after the war, some people in Myrtle Beach thought, that having that Army base here, that really helped us. We should try to get that back. But after peacetime, things were rapidly changing for the military. In 1947, the Army Air Corps actually becomes its own separate branch. They become the United States Air Force. That same law is also the one that said, hey, you're not the War Department anymore, you're the Department of Defense. And the other big thing that's going on is that, the era of propeller planes, that's over. Now we're in the jet age. So planes are faster and things are changing. The big thing, though, that happens, and we're going to come back to this in a little bit, is the Korean War. So that's the first war fought against a communist enemy to contain the spread of communism, and it's an armistice. We are able to preserve the independence of the Republic of Korea, but we do end up with a stalemate on the Korean Peninsula, and now we've seen, all right, modern wars are not going to look like World War II. Their technology has changed. Things are going to be very different going forward. And one of the main differences is that the new Air Force is not organized the way the Army Air Corps was. There were a couple of different branches within the Air Force, but this is the big one that I want to talk about, Tactical Air Command. So their job was interceptors, air superiority fighters, ground attack aircraft, basically any airplane with one pilot whose job is to shoot down other planes or destroy things on the ground, they're under Tactical Air Command. Their mission, and this gets a little technical, so bear with me here, their mission was get them. So this is the umbrella under which the Myrtle Beach new Air Force Base is going to be operating. They decide in 1954 to reactivate the base. Construction begins in 1955. A lot of the World War II buildings, they're too small, they're old. So many of them are made of wood that during World War II, Myrtle Beach Army Airfield's most popular nickname was Splinter City. So they build new bases, they lengthen the runway, build new hangars, new command posts. The base opens in 1956. And the last hang-up, though, before the base opened was in 1954, Hurricane Hazel hits the South Carolina coast. So if you remember the pictures of Myrtle Beach from the late 40s that we saw a moment ago, that's what got hit by Hurricane Hazel. It was a big hurricane, and they didn't have the technology that we have today. So when they sent out an evacuation order, that meant literally sending out the handful of emergency responders and police officers in Myrtle Beach, and they literally went door to door, knock on the door, wait for someone to come and say, there's a hurricane coming, you need to evacuate, you need to leave now. And a lot of buildings were completely destroyed by this massive hurricane. And most of the people, thankfully, the evacuation was successful, people were able to get out. Not many lives were lost, thankfully. It's a tragedy that any were, but the damage could have been significantly worse. But what happens after this is that now large portions of the Grand Strand, the buildings are just obliterated. They're piles of debris. One statistic that really stuck out to me was that more than, I think, 80% of the buildings in Garden City were gone. A quarter of the buildings in Surfside Beach, gone. So a lot of these people, they take their insurance payout and they say, well, we could rebuild or we can sell to a developer. So this is what helps start that wave of new hotels, condos, high-rises. This is sort of what's helping turn Myrtle Beach, giving it that skyline that we think of today. So, and I know it also sounds odd that the Army the Air Force opens a base, and then this happens, and they didn't change their plans. I guess they thought, well, we're going to build our buildings out of brick, we're going to withstand it. So it's, credit to the officer who said, we will weather the hurricanes. We need a base here, so we're going to build it here. So when the base opens in 1956, this is a brochure from our collection. It's a milestone for the jet age. This is going to really increase the size of the town. It's going to bring a lot of people, a lot of infrastructure. And the very first commander of the base is this gentleman, Colonel Francis Gabreski. And if that name sounds familiar to you, he was one of the most decorated aces the United States had during World War II. And during the Korean War, he became an ace again. So he's one of a very short list of people that were an aerial ace in 2 different wars. And he was regarded as a very skilled combat pilot, as a very gifted leader. So the fact that he is the very first commander of this base right out of the gate, that's what my English teacher would have called setting a tone. So the first major deployment that the units at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base have is to the Lebanon crisis. This is kind of an overlooked event from the early Cold War, but essentially what happened is that the president of Lebanon in the Middle East, he was very pro-American, he was very pro-West, very good ally to the United States, and some of his government officials and his military leaders actually thought that he was too friendly to the United States. They thought that he was trying to ally with the West instead of trying to ally with other countries in the Middle East. So his own government tried to overthrow him, and the United States intervened. We were able to help keep him in power, and this is one of the first times that America intervenes abroad as part of an intervention to stop the spread of communism. In that before, there's the precedent that, okay, America's not going to get involved unless the United States or American citizens are directly in danger, whereas now it's now the strategic paradigm has shifted. America is going to get involved to protect our interests and to help prop up and to help support friendly regimes. So this is a trend that's going to continue for quite a while during the Cold War. And the next big thing that happened was the Berlin crisis. So after World War II, Germany is divided, the Soviets get the eastern half, the Americans get the western half, and then the city of Berlin, which is several hundred miles inside East Germany, is also divided between the Russians and the Western allies. And in the early days of the Cold War, people from East Germany cannot get out of there fast enough. And a lot of them, they just go to West Berlin, get on a train, and then go to West Germany. They are leaving as fast as they can. And recognizing this, the Soviet leaders say, should we change our policies to keep people here, or should we build a giant wall and treat everyone in this city like they're a prisoner? Let's go with the second one. So they build a giant wall around West Berlin, Berlin Wall, and they try to essentially strong-arm the Western allies out of the city. And this is one of the closest times we've come to starting a Third World War. This is the famous photograph of American tanks at a border checkpoint. You can see kind of in the background Soviet tanks. So units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base are sent to American air bases in Germany. That's how serious this is. And when we hear that, we think, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Put your guys closer to the front line. But really think about that for a second. They're being moved to Europe with the expectation they're going to be fighting in a war. Thanks to some declassified Soviet documents, we know what the Russians were planning to do, which is drop nuclear weapons on several European cities and then send millions of men, millions of tanks. Their orders were, go east, get as far as you can, as fast as you can, which means the units from Myrtle Beach Air Force bases, those airmen, they were told the Soviet army is going to be coming on you like a wave. Your job is to slow it down until we can get reinforcements from the United States. They are being told your job is to blunt the tip of the Soviet spear and to essentially keep enough of Western Europe open that we can bring in more people from the United States. That's really, really scary when you think about it. But again, they stepped up, they did their duty, thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, the Berlin crisis ended, war is averted. For now. Because very soon after we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of those events where you have to really put it in its place in history to make sense. Because because when Fidel Castro and his communists came to power, that happened within a week of Yuri Gagarin's first flight in space. So essentially, over the course of about 2 weeks in the early 60s, the Soviets put a man in space, and a communist regime comes to power 90 miles from the continental United States. It's one of the lowest points of the Cold War for America. And obviously, we are not thrilled that now there's a communist country within literally swimming distance of Florida. So there's actually plans drawn up to invade Cuba, for a full-armed military invasion of Cuba, and then the news comes out that the Soviets have been putting nuclear weapons in Cuba. And that, understandably, makes people panic. Because, oh no, now short-range Soviet missiles could be deployed from Cuba and get to the United States very quickly before we could respond. So the Kennedy administration starts a blockade of Cuba. The United States Navy is essentially nose-to-nose with the Soviet Navy, and it looks like that the Soviets are going to try to send people into Cuba, a shooting war will start, and that best-case scenario, World War III starts. Worst-case scenario, a global thermonuclear war starts. And the units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base are sent to Florida. So their job is, and thanks to some declassified documents we know, the United States government had a fully drafted plan to invade Cuba with amphibious landings and airborne landings followed by a larger army invasion. The units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, their job would have been to provide air cover for that, because besides missiles, the Soviets also had surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and 10,000 soldiers on the island of Cuba. So the people from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, they were likely told, if we invade Cuba, you have two jobs. Keep our soldiers safe, and if you see a Soviet launch site, destroy it, because if you don't, that's a major American city gone. So they would have been running essentially on-side defense for an American invasion of Cuba during, again, what I believe as a historian is the closest we've ever come to a Third World War. And while I was researching this, I was looking up newspaper articles to see what the pilots said about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how they reacted. And I found one article that kind of melted my heart a little bit. Because obviously when they were stood down and they were sent back to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, the pilots were all thrilled that a massive war hadn't started. But one pilot in particular was just thrilled because he got to meet his baby daughter for the first time, because she was born the day before he got back. So I just thought it was a really sweet, kind of touching, humanizing element for what is otherwise a very, very frightening story of how close we almost came to the brink in the Cold War. And while this is going on, this is what Myrtle Beach looks like now in the 60s. This is getting closer to the skyline that we recognize, and at one point there was a rumor that Myrtle Beach Air Force Base was going to close. It didn't, but there was apparently a very persistent rumor. And I read an editorial in the Myrtle Beach Sun News that said, the base might close. Some people are saying, we might be able to buy cheap houses if the government leaves. We won't have to listen to those really loud airplanes anymore. And he says that's actually he says if the base leaves, that would be really, really bad. A lot of people work for the base. They either work indirectly, they either work on the base in a civilian job, or they own a gas station or a laundromat, or or an alteration business. So a lot of civilian jobs in Myrtle Beach were tied, even if they weren't paid by the government, they were very closely tied to the Air Force Base. And the line he said, though, the way he ended his editorial really stuck out to me. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here slightly, but he says, if the base closes, we're going to go back to having a recession 6 months a year. Because when the Air Force Base came to Myrtle Beach, obviously it spread the word. A lot of people who maybe wouldn't have really paid attention because they're stationed here, now they're intimately familiar with the area, they get to travel around. But it also helped bring a lot of economic development to the area that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Because again, a lot of people, they have jobs on the base or near it, and this growth encourages people, not only from up north, but from the surrounding parts of South Carolina, to move to the coast. There were a handful of beach communities around Myrtle Beach, only 2 of them were actually incorporated towns before Myrtle Beach Air Force Base reactivated in 1956. All of those other communities, they were just what we would call communities or census-designated places. They were essentially dots on a map. In fact, according to the official history of the town of Surfside Beach, before the base reactivated, there were 6 permanent families who lived year-round in Surfside Beach, and that was it. So this base brought a lot of jobs and a lot of people. In the early 60s, there were only about 7,800 people in Myrtle Beach as a whole. The Air Force Base had counting families, wives, children, 7,100 people. So the base is essentially almost the same size as the city, and it's a self-contained community that's also kind of within the larger town. So a lot of the economic development that's happening in Myrtle Beach is, you can point a finger and say, this is happening directly because there is a very large Air Force Base here. And something else I've read was that some of the loudest proponents for the base, for keeping it there, were the people that own the bars and restaurants, because suddenly they don't have to close up shop and pray that somebody comes in the wintertime, because there's always airmen who are more than happy to come in and eat and play a game of pool and to hang out and spend their money. So the next big thing that comes up is the Vietnam War. By this point, the F-100 Sabres have been replaced by the Corsair aircraft, and these are ground attack aircraft. They were cutting edge in the 1960s, and units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base are sent over to Southeast Asia. They're stationed at different bases over there in Cambodia and Thailand, and they are providing close air support for American soldiers on the ground. And they had an impossible task ahead of them, because I mentioned the Korean War earlier and how that ended in a stalemate. The lesson that the United States government and that the Department of Defense seems to have taken away from Korea was that they couldn't fight modern wars the way that we had fought World War II. And when I say that, during World War II, the enemies were Italy, Japan, Germany, so we invaded parts of Japan, we invaded Germany, we invaded Italy, we took their capital, overthrew their government, the war was over. That made sense. But during the Korean War, in the early days of the war, Americans enjoyed a lot of military success. Our army pushed the North Korean army almost to the border with China. And then China intervened in the Korean War, and they pushed us back down the peninsula until things kind of settled out at a stalemate that would eventually become the demilitarized zone. So when the Vietnam War happens, the Department of Defense thinks, well, if we try to do this like we did in Korea, we'll start another war with China and maybe the Soviet Union, and now both of those countries have nuclear weapons. So instead of invading North Vietnam, we're just going to kind of keep the war going where it is, and we're going to try to keep it going long enough that they give up. And they also said, hey, we don't want to provoke the Soviets and the Chinese, so we're going to have rules of engagement. So we're going to have rules that our soldiers have to follow, but that the other side doesn't. And if that doesn't sound like a good way to fight a war, it's because it's really not. So the Vietnam War was essentially set up from the beginning to be a very, very difficult strategic thing for the military to do. And it is a credit to all the soldiers who were there, not just the ones from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, that they were able to accomplish everything they did in spite of the very contradictory orders they were being given from the highest levels of the chain of command. In fact, one of the last shots fired by American forces in the Vietnam War was fired by a plane from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, and they actually made a little plaque about it that we have on display upstairs. So if you go to the big wooden cabinet with the stained glass in the hallway, you'll see a little plaque about eye level. That's what that is. So when Vietnam ends, Cold War takes on a different tune, because the American people, very understandably, are not eager to start another big, drawn-out war that doesn't really seem to be strategically very linear. And while that's going on, so after Vietnam wraps up, Myrtle Beach is really starting to grow, because now the post-war economy is really hitting its stride. Things will later change in the 70s, but immediately, though, a lot of the GIs from World War II, they've established themselves, they have careers, they have families, and thanks to Dwight Eisenhower's interstate system, it's a lot easier to travel. And a lot of them think, well, I could go to Florida, try to fight the crowds down there, or I could go to Horry County, maybe where they were stationed. So people start coming here, and something that helps this along is that when the gas crisis hits in the 1970s, a lot of people that probably would have driven all the way to Florida decide, well, I can go from New York City, for example. Horry County is almost halfway between New York City and Miami, Florida. So a lot of people that are trying to, still give their kids a great vacation, but don't want to spend their life savings on gas, maybe they just come here instead of going all the way to Florida or Alabama. And this is also, if you look at graphs of Horry County's population, the 70s is when it really starts to take off and starts to grow by leaps and bounds in a way that, well, frankly, it still is today. And in the 70s, the civic leaders of Myrtle Beach say, hey, the small airport we have in North Myrtle Beach, that's not cutting it anymore. That's designed for private air travel. We actually need a proper airport that can support jet airliners. So it takes a couple of years of letter writing and procedure, but they convinced the Department of Defense to let them bring civilian planes into Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. And they actually built a new terminal in 1977. And for a couple of years, Piedmont Airlines, whose aircraft is pictured here, if you wanted to come to Myrtle Beach by a plane, unless you owned a private plane, that was your only option. So we see from the 70s and going forward that a lot more people, because they can now fly here, are coming to Myrtle Beach to Myrtle Beach for their vacation, and a lot of people are even moving here. So now the town, it doesn't just dry up and get quiet in the winter. There's actually a larger year-round population that can provide a bigger economic base. And then in 1989, Hurricane Hugo comes. And it wasn't as bad as Hurricane Hazel. Thankfully, our knowledge of architecture had come a long way since then, but it was still a devastating hurricane. A lot of buildings were destroyed. We have accounts from some of the airmen who were told to hold down the fort at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, and it was harrowing, just being hunkered down in a cinder block building, hoping that the floor doesn't flood out from under you. So Hurricane Hugo, it wasn't quite as bad as Hazel. It didn't wipe the slate clean the way that Hazel did, but it destroyed a lot of buildings, and it was essentially one of the biggest hurricanes this part of the country had in a long time. And I know it sounds like I'm kind of harping on this, but it is going to become important later. So the next really big military event that happened was that units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base are deployed for the first Gulf War. So Saddam Hussein, to make a long story short, he says, hey, Kuwait has a lot of oil and I want it, so we're going to invade Kuwait and take them over. And that was, of course, a brazen violation of international law. So America and a coalition of our allies, we go and we chase the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and we manage to liberate them, restore them as an independent nation. And something to keep in mind is that when we did this, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world. And they were well supplied, they were well equipped, they were a very, very big military power in that region. And the plane that these airmen are in front of, this is a unit from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. This is an A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog. And you can see, if you look at the very front of the plane, you'll see a little tube sticking out. That's a gun. It fires bullets that are, so for those of you who may not be familiar with firearms, a bullet is measured by the diameter of the base of it, so the circle at the bottom. The circle at the bottom of that one is 30 millimeters. That gun was designed to do one thing: destroy Soviet tanks. Saddam Hussein's army had a lot of Soviet tanks before the war, and that plane was really, really good at destroying them. And in fact, and if you're thinking, okay, 30 millimeters, that's a metric measurement, we do have one of those bullets in the display case upstairs that I mentioned. Try to picture it in your head. Whatever you're thinking, it's not big enough. So the Gulf War was where units from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, with their Warthogs, they were able to go over, they were, got to fight exactly how they were trained. Everything went according as planned. It was a resounding victory for the United States and for our allies. And it ended up being essentially the last kind of final big hurrah for the units at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. Because, like the song said, times are a-changin'. Because as the late 80s come on, Suddenly, our old enemy, the Soviet Union, isn't looking so good. One of the first big events that kind of pushed the dominoes to fall, so to speak, was that in the late 80s, the Soviet government said, hey, we are not going to intervene in the affairs of our puppet countries anymore. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but back then that was earth-shattering. Because from the end of World War II well into the 1970s, the Soviet government's policy for its allies was, all right, you're going to stay in line, you're going to do what we say, and if you don't, the Soviet army is going to come and put you back in line. So they brutally repressed revolutions and opposition movements across Eastern Europe at gunpoint. So when they say they're not going to do that anymore, it's an event that doesn't get talked about very often, but that's one of the things that really opened the floodgates, was that suddenly there's not the threat of an imminent Soviet invasion if you are in a communist country outside of Russia itself. And from there, things start happening very quickly. In 1989, there's a series of revolutions across Eastern Europe. Communist governments are overthrown. Communist leaders flee their capitals. New governments are formed. The government of East Germany goes on TV and says, "Hey, we're not gonna stop you at the Berlin Wall anymore. If you want to leave, you can just leave. It's fine." So the Germans take initiative and they take sledgehammers and they tear down the Berlin Wall. And from there, that's pretty much that ship has sailed. And while this is going on, Congress, they're like, okay, Cold War is coming to an end. We don't have to worry about the Russian bear anymore. We have a lot of bases that were opened in the 50s and 60s, and some of them we don't need anymore. So the base realignment, there are several different iterations of it. The big one passed in 1990, and one of the bases on the list to close was Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. And from there, we start to see elections in Eastern Europe. Communism is it's swept out of office. You know, the Soviets' allies are now that they're free to do what they want, they really don't want to be communist anymore. The next year, the Soviet Union itself collapses. Soviet troops withdraw. Mikhail Gorbachev hands over his nuclear launch codes to the Russian president. The hammer and sickle is lowered. The Cold War is over. Global communism, at least from the Soviet Union, its day has kind of passed. So that's the end of the Cold War, and 2 years later, the Base Realignment and Closure Act comes to pass. Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, the units there are either transferred to other bases, some units are broken up and their planes are sent to other military installations, and the complex is turned over to the Horry County government. So you may be thinking, all right, is this where we're going to wrap up the presentation? Not quite. The story doesn't end there. One of the major things that happened in the tail end of the Myrtle Beach Air Force Base era was that we were designated as an emergency landing site for the space shuttle. And the map was published on the internet a few years ago. There were a series of airports on the East Coast that had long runways, which Myrtle Beach Air Force had because it was designed to be able to take off combat planes, was that if there had been a problem while the space shuttle was launching, while it was still in atmosphere, it would have diverted and landed. So the first stop was Jacksonville, the next stop was Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, and then the next designated runway after that was somewhere in the mid-Atlantic states. So for my money, the airport in Daytona Beach, that sounds like if there's a problem immediately land there, but then there's a big gap on either side of Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. And I'm a historian, not an engineer, so this is just a guess. But to me, it sounds like they were banking that if there was a problem for most of that launch window, it probably would have had to come here, because there just weren't a lot of airports in that very direct line north that would have had that length and that capacity without having to divert a space shuttle pretty far inland. So the space shuttle, and we would continue, even after the Air Force Base closed, the base continued to be an emergency landing site until the space shuttle program was ultimately discontinued. So what happened to the base? Today, it's Myrtle Beach, the runway, the hangars, the old terminal, that's Myrtle Beach International Airport. It's actually the second busiest airport in South Carolina. So when I read that surprised me, because Charleston's number one, that makes sense, but I figured Greenville or Columbia would have number two, but no, it's us. So Myrtle Beach International Airport, it has direct flights to more places than you would think, and whenever my relatives have flown into town, they've said they've liked it. So who's in charge of this now? So there's a Department of County Government they're the Department of Airports. They run all of the public airports here in the county. So Myrtle Beach International is the big one. There's the Grand Strand Airport, which is I mentioned there was a second smaller airport in North Myrtle. That's what that is. There's the airport in Conway, and there's also the Twin City Airstrip in Loris. So those are the 4 public airports in Horry County. The county government is in charge of that. They're the ones who do the leases with the concession stands. So they're a big department of county government that manages this airport, which is public in a way that a lot of other airports aren't. And when the base closed, a lot of the buildings there, a few months ago we had Colonel Stryer come and give a talk. He was one of the people that was instrumental in redeveloping the base. And the way that he put it, and really it stood out to me, was when they were trying to decide what to do with the base afterwards, he said all the right buildings were in the wrong places and all the wrong buildings were in the right places. So there's not as many physical buildings as you would think today, even though the Air Force Base was really big. It had, I believe one count was 800 homes. It had a big hospital. It had several churches. It even had its own Boy Scout troop. So a lot of those buildings, they just weren't able to be used again. And it's ironic in a way that one of the largest single parts of the Air Force Base, aside from the runway that's still very recognizable from how it would have looked in the Cold War, is actually the golf course, which we're in Myrtle Beach, Golf Town, USA. That is, when you leave Myrtle Beach Airport, there's a sign bolted to a pole when you turn out of the parking lot that says, "Welcome to Golf Town, USA." And right behind that is Whispering Pines Golf Course. This was built for the Air Force built this in the 1950s. Apparently the way it worked was that the entry fee for members of the Air Force was determined by your rank. So a private would pay one rate, and then a general would pay a kind of stair-stepped up higher rate. So Whispering Pines is largely the same. It is a municipal golf course owned by the city of Myrtle Beach today, and I think it's really great free advertising. You know, what's that old saying that real estate agents say? Location, location, location. Well, what better way to advertise that Myrtle Beach is a really big golf town than to have a golf course literally within line of sight of the airport that people come into town on. You couldn't have designed that better if you gave a marketing major a dry erase board and a map. So that golf course is still there today, and a lot of the residential part of the base became what is the Market Common neighborhood today. So this is a pretty upscale place. There's houses, there's shopping centers. I'm actually really partial to the movie theater they have there. I've seen quite a few movies there. I really enjoyed it. And I think what this tells us is that when the Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, when they were getting ready to close it in the 1980s, a lot of people really raised the alarm. Because if you remember, in the 1960s and 70s, when they talked about closing the base, people said, well, if they close the base, we're going to go back to the way things were in the 50s. We're going to have a recession 6 months a year. You know, millions of dollars of paychecks and jobs are just going to disappear. What's going to happen to us? But that didn't happen because as the base grew, it helped the city grow, and it brought in enough people that when the base closed, the city didn't fall into, an economic ruin. Because of all this construction, because there were so many more places that people could live, it actually helped bring more people in. And when I found the government report for the Base Realignment and Closure Act, it was talking about why certain bases were chosen to be closed. A lot of them were small, or they were old. They were, from the Korean War or World War II, and it would have cost too much to upgrade them. But that's not the case here. Myrtle Beach Air Force Base was built after the Cold War. It had been kept up. It was big enough and in good enough shape that they could land a space shuttle on it. The reasons that they said for closing it, there were three. And I'm sure there was a whole discussion in a congressional committee somewhere, but the big three reasons they highlighted were increased air traffic, increased ground congestion, and bad weather. So essentially what happened was that the Air Force Base brought more people to Myrtle Beach and the surrounding area. It helped get the region's economic legs under it and helped it grow from a small town on the coast that nobody had ever heard of into a major resort city that's really well known across the United States. And that brought in people, that brought in airport, and ultimately that's what helped the government decide that Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, it wasn't strategically necessary, because they thought, well, it's harder for the airmen to find a place to live. It's getting crowded. You know, if you've been on Highway 501 in the summer, you know how difficult it can be to get around. Imagine trying to drive through that traffic while you're on your way to go fight a war. And the other big thing that convinced them was Hurricane Hazel really put them on alert. So I mentioned earlier that Hurricane Hazel hadn't fazed them, but Hurricane Hugo really kind of put them on notice and made them realize, there could potentially be a massive storm that could wipe out food, power, communications for several days, and if that happens, there's nothing you can really do for that. And potentially a massive strategic Air Force base could be cut off from the world for several days, and there's nothing they could do about it. So ultimately, the United States Air Force Base at Myrtle Beach brought a lot of prosperity and a lot of attention to Myrtle Beach and to Horry County, and it helped really make it into the place that we know it is today. And ultimately that prosperity meant that the Air Force couldn't afford to keep the base anymore, that it wasn't the link in the strategic chain that it had been previously. So the lesson to take away from all this, I think, is that the Air Force Base, even though it has been gone for several decades, you might actually, y'all probably wouldn't be surprised, but with all the work that's been done in Myrtle Beach, there's Warbird Park, there's memorials, there's a lot. When they redeveloped the area, especially Market Common, they made a lot of effort to memorialize all of the airmen and their families who served at the base, who helped keep America safe throughout some of the most turbulent times in our history. But a lot of people will say, I had no idea there was a base here. So I think the most important thing we can do is to keep the memory of the base alive and to remember the sacrifice of all those who so bravely served their country throughout the Cold War. Thank you.